Welcome to Scripps, President Keene. Welcome back, returning students. And above all, welcome to all of you, the class of 2026. I hope these 4 years will be a period of great intellectual fulfillment for you. I've been asked by the Dean to give today's address in a way that both advocates for the liberal arts generally and discusses my own work specifically. To do that, I've chosen a title that might seem surprising to you. Why is an English professor exhorting you to study history? And in such a large typeface, I might add. Well, by study history, I don't mean that you need to major in history. Obviously, you should major in English because English is the best major at Scripps. History is not something confined to a particular discipline. It doesn't just mean a set of dates and facts, a sequence of political leaders or regimes, a division of time into centuries, as any historian will tell you. It can entail, and for a long time in the university, it has entailed, among other things, social history, the large-scale transformations of culture and society, the alterations and revolutions in thought and life, even when those changes have taken place far from centers of authority, like governments or leaders or militaries. In this respect, history is something that surfaces from or seeps into many different fields and disciplines. This is the case across the humanities most of all, but it's also true of the sciences and the social sciences and the arts. Let me define history for now as a way of thinking of ourselves and others in time. It's an attitude toward life that refuses to take for granted that present conditions are inevitable. It's a commitment to studying all human endeavors with a sensitivity to their contingency, the fact that they may occur or have occurred, but were not predestined to occur. According to this view, we ourselves are not quite as preordained to be here right now, to exist at all, as we might like to think. I'm emphasizing this attitude, this approach to thinking about ourselves in time, because I think it might be the best starting point to one's undergraduate education. It allows us to combat a habit that I and many others find especially worrisome in so much contemporary culture, which is usually called presentism. To be presentist is not just to think about the past through the prism of the now, but to rely always on our own standards. Faced with a depiction of an ancient culture, we compare it to what we are used to, often unfavorably. Encountering an attitude that we may now find retrograde, we take a supercilious posture to it, since we would never think that way today. Now, by all means, let's identify that attitude and ask how it might have taken root. Let's study how what we might abhor happened. But rather than being detached and dismissive, let us be curious and direct. In literary study, a common version of this is known as the problem of the relatable. For example, a character in a novel from a previous era is judged relatable or not relatable based on current mores and habits of mind. So, Mrs. Ramsay in To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, relatable. Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch by George Eliot, definitely relatable. Jean Brodie and Muriel Sparks, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, maybe not so relatable. Let's hold that figure at arm's length. Now, of course, we all do this. We can't help reading backward from our present vantage point. But let's submit this tendency to some scrutiny. Why must we evaluate novelistic character based on this criterion? Why should we necessarily want to relate, want to shoehorn those long ago imaginary persons into the mold we are comfortable with today? Maybe the opposite is also true. Maybe we can read, for example, Victorian fiction with an equal alertness to the otherness of those characters, their strangeness and individual coherence. We can immerse ourselves in the arts and cultures of the past precisely to be made aware of their difference from us and to encounter them as phenomena that are not there to prepare for our arrival. Now, on the one hand, we can never fully escape our presentism. We are, to some extent, locked in our position here, sitting in Balch Auditorium, each one of us embodied, each one of us constrained by our experiences and limitations, each of us susceptible to unnecessary myopia. And I should say that there have been, in the last few years especially, some forceful defenders of presentism who argue that it could be used strategically. In other words, that it could bring the past into a kind of dialectic relation to the present, especially in political ways. Well, sure, and if we define presentism that broadly, it's difficult to be against it. But if it can be used in that way, it's not really presentism. Of course, let the past illuminate our present predicament, but let this not allow us any easy over-evaluation of ourselves. It can actually be thrilling, as residents of the contemporary, to bring ourselves down a few rungs. That act of humility is one of the preconditions, I think, for a university education. If presentism is a form of narcissism, we're absorbed in our own self-image, then let's try not to be narcissistic. Now, this will be an awkward segue because I'm going to shift from railing against narcissism to talking about myself. But I was asked to speak a bit about my work, so before I close, let me say a few words about how these questions of present and past play out in my own writing. My first two books were about the 19th and 20th century novel, mostly in Britain, also in France. Both were concerned in different ways with the moral implications of realism in the novel. The authors I've been writing about for years are some of the same ones that I teach in my seminars at Scripps: Eliot and Hardy, Flaubert and Zola, Conrad, Wolfe, and Lawrence, up to and including contemporary novelists like Zadie Smith. For many years now, I've been most interested in the implications and consequences for literature of the climate emergency. Climate was the concluding subject of my last book, and I wrote about it again for a piece I published over the summer about literary criticism and the unfolding catastrophe. It's also the main concern of my third book, which I'm writing now. But in writing about climate, I'm focusing not on current fiction that depicts the disaster explicitly, not books set in the present day or in a not-so-distant apocalyptic future. This is a genre known as cli-fi, perhaps known to many of you. Instead, I'm studying the way that our knowledge and our experience of the emergency today has a tendency to obstruct or to warp our experience reading the literature and beholding the art of the recent past. So, to take one example, can we still read novels set amidst coal mines, as some of the masterpieces of the late 19th and early 20th century were, like Zola Germinal and Lawrence's The Rainbow, and continue to carry with us some of the same principles and conventions of reading that we used to? On the contrary, our knowledge of the consequences of extraction and burning of that fossil material impedes our encounter as readers with those masterpieces. They look strange to us in a new way. Or, to take a different example from my book, the rich tradition of photography of gas stations in Los Angeles. This was a favorite subject for some of the most influential photographers of the 60s and 70s, like Ed Ruscha and Stephen Shore. Some of those pictures of LA gas stations were taken a few blocks from where I grew up, so they hold a special power for me as likenesses of a world and a past I know well. But what do we see now when we look at such images? The iconography of a gas station no longer retains its stable meaning. The extraordinary transformation of our world and our atmosphere has transformed the logic of that visible world. A gas station is no longer the same subject for us, now that our disenchanted knowledge of the consequences of burning petroleum corrupts the way we perceive a picture of one. Even the sky in 1970s photography can seem warped. In a photograph, it may be a sky of atmospheric carbon dioxide at 330 parts per million. Now that sky is at 420 parts per million. It's not the same sky. In my book, I am arguing that the scale of the catastrophe marks a rupture in our encounter with artworks we once thought to be somehow stable, but which now seem to us eerie and remote. Now, these are questions about literature and art and culture, but they are infused with questions about history. To me, the most significant writer on climate is a historian, the Swedish human ecologist and scholar of extraction history, Andreas Malm. He may be known to many of you as a climate activist. One of his most recent books is How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which makes the moral and strategic case for property sabotage. His work has been dedicated to showing, patiently and systematically, but also polemically, the roots of the fossil economy, from the late 18th century rise of steam power through our own contemporary situation. In his magnificent earlier book, Fossil Capital, from 2016, he writes, "Global warming is a sun mercilessly projecting a new light onto history. Only now is it becoming apparent what it really meant to burn coal and send forth smoke from a stack in Manchester in 1842. When natural scientists discovered global warming, they passed on a discovery to historians yet to be made on anything like a comprehensive scale. These things were there for 2 centuries, invisible up to the present. Here it is a matter of searching not for climate in history, but for history in climate." Let me pause on this last distinction because Malm is making a very important point. Climate in history is essential. We need to know the trajectory of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, for example, so that we can distinguish between 1842 and 1975 and 2022. But history in climate means investigating the sources, the patterns of causation, the anthropogenic record of how it came to be, that we are at 420 parts per million, and those beautiful green lawns outside this auditorium look increasingly strange. Now, at first glance, this may seem to you an example of the kind of presentism I was warning you against just a few minutes ago. We should consider the past on its own terms, I said, not exclusively through the screen provided by the present. True, but I want to suggest that the magnitude of the emergency actually complicates this view. On the one hand, yes, the past 200 years are a story of accumulation, leading to the present. The smoke that came from the stack in Manchester in 1842 sits, in its special way, above us right now, and is a small part of the aggregate past that has put us in a crisis. But on the other hand, this is not a trajectory that was preordained. Certain things happened or did not happen. If the rise of steam power had not developed according to the whims of factory owners in the 1780s, if 19th century colonialism hadn't discovered new sources of coal in present-day Indonesia and enriched certain European companies, if ExxonMobil hadn't suppressed the knowledge they had in the 1980s about greenhouse gas emissions, if this month's climate bill hadn't been watered down by a senator in the pocket of the West Virginia coal industry, the list goes on, and it reminds us that by studying history in climate, we can see anew that the past is a series of contingencies with specific actors enthralled to specific realms of power. Climate is proof that history leads to us, but also proof of the opposite, that it might not have been this way. This most significant fact of our lives today, the climate emergency, is at once a diagnosis of the present and a case against presentism. In 1938, a year before the Second World War, Virginia Woolf published one of her book-length essays, the feminist anti-war manifesto, 3 Guineas, where she imagined a scenario in which she has been asked to donate money to different causes, including for the rebuilding of a women's college. She considers the request, but wants to impose some conditions. It must be an experimental college, an adventurous college, Woolf writes. It should exclude the arts of dominating other people, the arts of ruling, of killing, of acquiring land and capital. If we are asked to teach, she clarifies, we can examine very carefully into the aim of such teaching and refuse to teach any art or science that encourages war. Today, at this experimental and adventurous college, where we are fortunate to gather, let us refuse to teach or to study any art or science that encourages brutality, warfare between people, of course, but also the further degradation of our biosphere. And let us do so by teaching and studying how we got to this point. Let us do nothing to encourage war or the expansion of fossil extraction, but let us study those wars and those smokestacks in Manchester so that we know what we are up against. History will be essential in this respect, but if you want to encounter formulations of genius like Woolf's, you should probably study literature too. Thank you very much.